Being able to customize your own quilts, pillows, wall hangings, whatever it is you'd like to sew is now totally possible with the latest Build-A-Block from Gemini and Crafter's Companion. This is the alphabets and numbers set, and it's a set of dies that's going to allow you to put any word, any name, any phrase, any punctuation on any quilt top. All right, let's get started. I'm going to show you how to cut it out and how to sew them up. So it comes in a drawer, just like all of the Build-A-Block systems. And these are all of the dies that you're going to be getting. And no, these don't look like the alphabet. They look like squares, half square triangles, and quarter square triangles. And that's exactly what they are. But they're in the perfect sizes that you can build the letters and numbers that you want. And how to do that is all in the instruction book. You can see here whether you want to build A, B, C, D, whatever letter, number, or shape you want. It shows you exactly how many squares to cut out of the actual letter and how many squares to cut out of the background fabric. So just like with the other Build-A-Blocks, you're building your block, and it's the same with the letters and numbers too. Okay, I'm going to spell out the word home, and I'm thinking about doing a little heart shape. There are some designs in this booklet too, so I think it'd be cute to do maybe a home with a heart and maybe the cross star or the flower, or even the little home sweet home house. No matter what you decide to build, they all come together in the same way, and it starts with cutting your fabric. I'm using fat quarters here, but you can use yardage or whatever fabric you've got lying around. And to spell out the word home, we're going to need a certain number of colored squares, and we're going to need a certain number of white. There is the odd quarter square triangle and half square triangle in some of the designs too, but for a lot of them, it's just squares sewn together. So it makes it perfect for a beginner. Don't assume that because it's letters and numbers, that this is automatically too hard for the beginner quilter. Most of these patterns are just a series of squares sewn together. There are the odd half square triangle and quarter square triangle on there too, but mostly it's basic sewing. So if you can sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you'll be able to do any word you can think of. So I'm going to start with my clear plastic plate. Then I'm going to add my metal shim. Then I want my fabric, and I'm using a fat quarter here. And in the instructions, it's going to tell you how many shapes of each one that you need. So for my letter, I need 10 squares and 4 half square triangles. So I'm going to cut them both at the same time. So line up your dies, then you add your plastic shim and your top plate. And the Gemini will take care of the cutting. No cranking, everything's electronic, and when it comes out the other side, you'll have perfectly cut shapes. There, perfectly cut. So with 100% cotton, you can get about 6, even 8 layers of fabric cut at one time. But depending on how thick your cotton is, you're going to want to play with it a little bit to see how many layers you can get. So the pattern calls for 4 half square triangles and 10 squares. So I just need to run this through one more time to get a few more squares. Perfectly cut. One more time. You're going to want to have at least one straight side of your die running along the grain line of your fabric. And if you really look closely at your fabric, you'll be able to see one way or another which way there's sort of a straight line. And that's where you want your straight line of your die to go. That's how you get a perfect cut like that. So this is enough for one letter. I'm going to go ahead and cut out the entire word home. Plus, I'm going to cut out the background fabric, which I'm going to use white. I'm going to need far more white than I am colored fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and count up how many background squares and how many background half square triangles and quarter square triangles I need, and I'm going to cut them all out at once. Okay, so I'm going to build the letters H-O-M-E. So you can see the H is only squares. All you have to do is a 1/4 inch seam allowance in between each square and build them together. So I'm going to go a little bit harder to start. Let's do the M. because the M is a series of squares and half square triangles. So let's start there. So lay out your block first. You can see in the diagram how many squares of every color that you need. One, two, three, four, five. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we need some half squares. And I'm using the 2.5 inch blocks. And that's going to give me in the end a 10-inch block. So I cut these out of the 2.5 inch die, and in the end that's going to give me a 10-inch square for each letter. You can start to see that M now taking shape. Okay, so once you've got your block laid out, it's time to sew it together. I like to sew the half square triangles in the block first. This way I can use chain piecing, which means sewing them together all at once. It just makes things a little bit faster. So put right sides together on all of your half square triangles. And line them up in front of your sewing machine. And what's great about using the Build-A-Block is that the seam allowance is already built into the die cut, which means all you need to do is sew from this point to this point, and you've got a 1/4 inch seam. So now I've got a little chain of half square triangles ready to be pressed. Just snip them apart. So now I'm going to press them. And I'm going to press towards the dark side of the triangle. And with them pressed, I'll lay the block back out again. Just follow the diagram. There, we can see our letter M. Okay, so now we want to take it row by row. So I'm going to turn over each of the first 2 sets of 2s. And always sewing right sides together along the right-hand side. And I'm going to go ahead and chain stitch these 2. That just means not cutting the thread in between each square. Just saves a lot of time. So now I've got a big chain of pieces that I need to rearrange again. Open them up and press. Okay, I'm going to press towards the dark side. Okay, so they're all pressed flat. And now we're going to flip them over again, right sides together. We'll sew this last row on at the very end. And again, chain piece them. So now we can sew that last little square to the strip. Right sides together. Even solid fabric, if you look closely, has a right side. It does help to stay organized if you continue to lay out each block in between sewing each strip. So now that I've got them all in strips, I want to press it one last time, but this time I want to make sure that the seams are all staggered. It's called nesting your seams, and it's going to make for a much flatter quilt top. So for my bottom row, they're going to go left. That means right, left, right, left. It may mean that you get the odd dark piece, but your seams will come together much nicer at the points if you take the time to nest them. Now we're going to sew the strips together. So just take them 2 by 2, right sides together. And because our seams are now alternated, with our finger you can sort of feel it nest up together. If you kind of roll your fingers back and forth, you can really feel those two seams come together, and then just take a nice pin and put it right down the center of that seam. This way, when you press it and flip it back over, your points will meet exactly in the middle, right where they're supposed to. And then just a 1/4 inch seam. And now we can add that bottom strip. Same thing, nest the seams. There, the perfect little letter. Now I can add it to the H, O, and E. Okay, once you have all your letters and any other designs you want to build done, lay them out. So now you see how each letter in the instructions gives you this side panel of white strips to give you a little buffer between the words, sort of like pressing spacebar. From building the block up already, we already know there's 5 squares. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew 5 background, for me that's white, squares together, and then sew those strips together to kind of buffer out my design. So once you have a strip, and you can see I sewed 2 strips of squares together, right sides together on the other side of my letter, just to give it a little extra space on the sides. And again, everything gets a 1/4 inch seam. So now that I'm happy with my spacing, I'm going to sew the letters together to make my word. Right sides together, and do your best to nest the seams. Pretty, right? Okay, now I'm going to start building with my other blocks, and I love the idea of using the Gemini fabric strip dies to create some really even borders and sashing throughout the quilt. Once my quilt block really starts to get long, then I like to pin, just to make sure everything's nice and even and doesn't get pulled with the weight of the fabric when it's going through the sewing machine. So we've sewn with squares and half square triangles, but lots of the numbers and even some of the image designs have quarter square triangles and rectangles in them. And they sew up just as easy. There's nothing to worry about. So when you cut them out, the sandwich is just the same. Lay out your pattern like I've done here with the little house. And you can see, I want you to treat the rectangles as if they were a square. So we're going to be making squares out of the rectangles. So just like we sew a half square triangle together, we're going to be sewing those rectangles together too. And once you've got your little chain of rectangles, you're going to treat them like any other sewn piece. You're going to open them up and press to the dark side. Okay, and now your rectangles are the same size as your squares. Because remember, the seam allowance is built in. So just lay it back out, and now you can treat the rectangles as if they were squares. And just continue to build until your pattern's together. Another shape that a lot of the numbers, letters, and designs have in them is the quarter square triangle, and they're easy to sew together too. Let me show you. So you're just going to flip one quarter square triangle over top of the other, and it's going to be critical that you remember to sew along the right side. So when this opens up, the reason why that's important is because when this opens up, it's going to give us a flat edge to sew this quarter square to. And remember, even with the quarter square triangles, the seam allowance is built in. So we're going from point to the other end, and then once we open it up, we'll sew point to point. So now what you're left with is two sides, and this is just a straight edge, right sides together, and sew point to point. And once you understand that almost all quilting is essentially sewing together squares with a 1/4 inch seam, you can build virtually any block. I love how with just a few squares, half square triangles, rectangles, you can basically create any word that you want, customizing your quilts, customizing throw pillows. What amazing gifts and keepsakes you can make with the Build-A-Block alphabets and number set. I can't wait to break this out for the holidays too.